Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about smite damage, skill damage, how would I compare the two, and then as far as if you want to translate the skill damage equivalent of smite damage, how we will make that conversion. Okay, so what you see on the screen is kind of clickbait, but actually in a very specific scenario, if you're hitting Luce, or Scipio Luce in that order, 49, 48 damage factor skill damage actually come out to the equivalent of hitting that march with a 2400 damage factor smite damage if the conditions are met. Okay, so unironically, that's actually the damage factor of William Wallace. That's the newest, one of the two new infantry commanders that's slated to come out. Obviously, it's a smite damage commander, and then smite damage and smite damage commanders have been on the forefront of what we've been talking about the last few days, so I think it's appropriate to actually use that number. So first we're going to cover how damage factors work, right? Because that's kind of like the foundation, so you have to have an understanding of that. From there, we'll actually go over smite versus skill damage, talk about what makes smite damage better than skill damage. It's two main factors. And then from there, I'll actually present specific scenarios where we'll use commanders. And you can see, depending on the commander, that number is going to fluctuate. Basically, how much better smite is better than skill. And then at the end, if I had to give a guesstimate, we're just like a rough, like napkin math. If you just want to kind of make a general assumption without having to get into the weeds of everything, how much better is smite damage compared to skill damage? Okay, so first thing, if you look at the formula at the top, that's a formula that I posted several times in my videos, but it was courtesy of Wick Gaming. And what it's just showing is how the number of troops, attack, defense, and health all interact with each other to produce a number, right? Now, if you see right here, this is saying damage factor for 200 troop loss. What it's actually talking about is when you launch a basic attack, right? That's going to be 200 damage factor. Now, the white damage you see on the screen, right? So if you were fighting someone else and you see a white damage that will tick every second, that will actually come out to about 400 damage factor, because every turn what's happening is one side is going to launch a basic attack, the other side is going to do a counter attack, and the other side is going to do a basic attack, and then the first side is going to do a counter attack. So when you add the two together, they'll come out to about 400 damage factor, and then that's what's happening per turn, and that's the white damage you see on the screen. Now, this is important to know because when you look at most commander that have a active skill that does damage, you're going to see a damage factor of that, right? So that essentially just becomes a multiple of that white damage or 400 damage factor. So this is theoretical, obviously. We don't have a commander that does 4,000 damage factor yet, but we did have a commander that did a 4,000 damage factor active skill. You can expect whatever the white number is, the active skill is going to do about 10x that amount of damage. Now, is that, for the most part, it's probably not going to be exactly 10x, just because most commanders, either through their talent tree or their kit or a combination of both, have some kind of skill damage mitigation, right? So it's probably going to be less than that. But if it wasn't affected by the skill damage mitigation, you could expect about 10x, okay? Next, we're going to quickly talk about the whole idea of additive versus multiplicative. I'll link a video I made talking about rare inscriptions, how we discovered the language led to that. It's about a 15-minute video. This I'm just going to cover in 30 seconds. But the whole idea is, if you look at this formula here, A plus B times C, right? Whatever's in the bracket, A plus B is going to be additive, right? So for example, if you have Nevsky, which deals more skill damage, and then you have, say like Luce, who takes 20% less skill damage, right? When you take 20% less skill damage, before we discovered this language, I just thought whatever skill damage I was supposed to take, I'm just going to multiply that by 80%, because that would be taking 20% less skill damage, right? But what we actually discover, and credit to C-Will for this, is that it's actually additive. So if Nevsky as a primary commander is going to deal 25% more skill damage, then Luce as the commander is going to take 20% less. 25 minus 20 will come out to 5, right? So instead of multiplying them, you're actually adding or subtracting them. Now, something that's multiplicative is if you look in rare or special inscriptions, right? The language will either say you get a skill damage boost, or for example, this special inscription here, It's saying you're increasing the skill damage resistance of the Wielders troop. That's multiplicative. So once you figure out what's A and B in the bracket, right? Once you add and subtract them together, then you're going to actually multiply that by C, and that's why it's called multiplicative. And then the thing that's in the bracket A and B is additive. Okay. For the most part, most of these like skill damage mitigation or increase that we're talking about is actually going to be additive, and I just wanted to throw that in there. So if you didn't know that, you have a quick understanding of that. Next, let's actually cover Smite versus skill damage. So before Liu Chen and Gorgo came out, any active skill was just considered skill damage, right? And there's ways to just increase the amount or the amplitude of that skill damage. So for example, I mentioned Nevsky earlier, right? The primary commander is going to deal 25% more skill damage. The secondary commander is going to deal 60% more skill damage, right? Everything, which is how do you increase the skill damage. When you have a skill damage increase, it only affects that active skill. You're not going to actually deal more white damage because of that, right? With the introduction of Smite Damage, if you read this, Smite Damage is affected by bonuses to normal damage instead of bonuses to skill damage. So now if I have a commander, say like Liu Che, where it says you're going to deal 10% more normal damage, here's the first reason why Smite Damage is better than skill damage. Because if I am increasing normal damage, that means my basic attack and my counter attack is going to be increased by 10%, right? So that white number that's supposed to be a 400 damage factor, when you increase it by 10%, right, it essentially comes out to 440 damage factor now. Like you're increasing the white damage. But that normal damage increase, not only does it increase the white damage, it's actually also increasing the active skill. So you're kind of double dipping there, right? Now, if you have a skill damage commander, if you get a normal damage increase, it's just going to increase the white damage, but it's not going to increase the skill damage. If the skill damage commander gets a skill damage increase, it's just going to increase the skill damage. It's not going to increase the white damage. So far right now, right, Gorgo, Liu Che, William Wallace, they all have skills that increase normal damage. And to be fair, there are some skill damage commanders that increase normal damage, but every single Smite Damage commander has skills that's going to increase normal damage, and it's way more effective. So when you see 10% normal damage increase, don't think it's the equivalent of 10% skill damage increase. It's actually going to be way more effective, and then the next page will actually cover about how much more effective it is, right? Now, the other reason, so that's the first reason why Smite Damage is better than skill damage. The other reason why is because there's way more ways where a commander or a march can mitigate skill damage, right? So for example, the Cav tree, I think it's called Emblazoned Shield. You put 3 points in there, you take 12% less skill damage. The defense tree and the support tree with loose formation, you take 9% less skill damage. Also in the support tree, you have emergency protection, 50% chance to reduce all incoming, when you take skill damage, to reduce all incoming skill damage by 15% for the next 3 seconds, right? So I kind of just came up with, okay, if you have a 50% chance to reduce it by 15%, let's just calculate the value at 7.5%. That would actually be 7.5% if it was actually just for that skill damage taken with no cooldown. But it's actually, you have a 50% chance to reduce that, and it's for 3 seconds. The skill damage mitigation is actually going to be higher than 7.5%, but we'll just use 7.5% for the sake of simplicity there, right? And then I forgot the name of the skill damage mitigation skill in the skill tree. That's kind of weird to say, but it's 6%. Okay, so these are built in inherently into the trees, and everyone is taking these skills in the respective trees, right? So if you have a commander like Nevsky, right, he's going to run the Cav tree and the skill tree. Essentially, his normal 18% skill damage mitigation that he's getting when fighting against skill damage commanders, when he gets hit by a Smite Damage commander, that doesn't work, right? So another way to think about it is, if a Smite Damage commander hits Nevsky Joan, it's going to do 18% more damage with that Smite damage factor compared to a skill damage, right? So that's another reason why Smite is so valuable, right? So the first one, normal damage increase, is going to increase the damage of the white. It's going to increase the white damage and the Smite damage. 2, there's a lot less ways to mitigate Smite damage than skill damage. Right, so how much better is Smite than skill, than a Smite commander than a skill commander, right? It actually depends from commander to commander, because 1, there's the talent trees they're using, but then 2, depending on whose kit you look at, they all have either no skill damage mitigation, some, or like some that are like triggered, but like it could be for like 3 seconds, right? There's just like a bunch of different factors. So because there's so many different variables, it's hard to just give a number and goes, hey, it's exactly this amount better, because you could calculate that maybe when you take, say, Gorgo Luchet versus Nevsky Joan, right? And then you could actually calculate that. But when there's like a variety of commanders and the combinations you can use, that number becomes a lot harder to pin down specifically. But we just talk about the talent trees that I mentioned earlier, right? If you do Nevsky Joan, right? Nevsky has a cav in the skill tree, and this is just a talent tree. That's 18%. You literally will have to have a 29-27 damage factor skill tree, or not skill tree, skill damage to do the same amount of damage that a 2400 damage factor Smite damage does, if that makes sense, right? Because for example, Nevsky's expertise, right? You could proc a health like to reduce the damage you take. Well, that's going to affect Smite damage and skill damage, so we're not going to count that. But literally, if you're doing Smite damage to Nevsky Joan, you're going to have an 18% advantage compared to skill damage. If it's ZL Herman, right, probably the strongest archer pair, out of ZL and Herman's kit, none of those are specific to skill damage only, but for the skill tree, you have 6%. So for ZL Herman, you would actually have to have a 25-53 damage factor skill damage to do the same amount of damage as a 2400 damage factor Smite damage. And then Scipio Luce is the craziest one, because if Scipio is a primary, right, you have the support tree. So you have 20% from Luce's kit, 20% skill damage. You take 20% less skill damage. You get 9% from the support tree. Emergency protection is one of those where 50% of the time you can reduce it by 15%. So I just counted it as 7.5%. Tetsudo formation is the fourth skill of Scipio. That one is 50% chance to reduce it by 30%. So I just counted that as 15%. When you add all of that up together, it becomes 51.5%, right? And it'll actually never come out to that number, because the one with the asterisk, you're either getting the full thing or not, right? I'm just kind of did that as average. But if you use the average, right, if you use 51.5% skill damage, you take less skill damage, then you literally will have to do 4,948 damage factor skill damage to do the equivalent damage to 2,400 Smite damage, right? It's pretty crazy. So Scipio Luce, ironically, is way more vulnerable to Smite damage compared to skill damage than any other commander out there, right? But also there's more. So to actually launch an active skill, right, on average is going to be somewhere between 6 to 10 turns. Okay, if you haven't launched your first skill cycle off, so a lot of times you don't get to benefit from Rejuvenate or like the commander's kit where you recycle rage faster. It's usually like 9 or 10 turns, more likely 10 turns. And then if you actually already fired an active skill, then you can get it down to like 7 or 8 turns usually. Right. This is assuming that the amount of rage that's required is going to be 1,000. So we're just going to use 8 turns just for shits and giggles, right? But if you think every white damage is 400 damage factor, right? Then over 8 turns, that's going to be 3,200 damage factor, right? And you need that many turns to actually launch an active skill. So if you take a commander like Luce or William Wallace, right? If you look at their kit, each of them actually have a guaranteed built-in 20% normal damage increase, William Wallace also provides another 10% smite damage increase, which I didn't count in here. I'm just going to use the 20%. So in theory, it's actually going to be higher. I'm not counting it, right? But if you count William Wallace, right, if you get 20% normal damage increase, that means 3,200 from the white damage, 2,400 from the smite damage times 1.2 will come out to 6,720 damage factor, right? In 8 turns, the white damage and the active skill. If you're counting it for a smite damage commander, right, it'll still be the 3,200, except you're not going to multiply that. But for you to get the same amount of damage factor, you're going to actually need a 46.7% skill damage increase to match the 20% normal damage increase as far as damage output, right? So in this case, you can see 46.67% skill damage increase to match the damage at 20% normal damage increase. So it's like more than 2 to 1. And I would actually argue it's probably not even as good, because you're not always guaranteed to launch your active skill, right? But every time you make contact with an opponent, you're going to be doing white damage. So for a smite damage commander, where you don't actually have to launch active skill and you could enjoy the benefit of just trading better through the white damage, that normal damage increase is actually way more beneficial than a skill damage increase, right? Like even this like percentage, I would say the the benefit actually skews even more towards normal damage than even like this like over 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, so how do we actually make a conclusion for this, right? Because it's actually really hard to say. There's so many moving parts I presented, because every single march will have their talent tree, which will have varying amounts of skill damage mitigation. Every commander, right, primary and secondary commander, they'll have varying degrees of skill damage mitigation. So like some commanders that are still close to the meta, in the meta, or you'll see on the field now, like Henry, Scipio, Boudica, Belisarius Prime, Luce, Gorgo, they all have some kind of skill damage decrease. So if you're hitting that march with one of those commanders with a smite damage commander, you're naturally going to deal a lot more damage with that active skill than if it was a skill damage commander. Now, Ashurbanipal kind of goes the other way. Ashurbanipal is actually one of the few that takes less normal damage, right? So Ashurbanipal will actually be tankier against smite damage than skill damage because of that. But that's actually in the minority. I think I looked through it really quick. The only one I saw that did that was Ashurbanipal and Babur, who, you know, people will probably roll their eyes because it's Babur and it's a siege commander. But Babur also takes less normal damage. And the other one to think about is skill cycle time, right? I used 8 turns to do the calculation before. If it was 10 turns, it would actually tilt in favor of smite damage even more. If it was 6 turns, it would tilt towards the skill damage a little bit more, skill damage commander even more. So we don't even know, because it depends, right? Like how many turns it actually takes to launch an active skill. You know, do they have a horn on them? You know, what talent did they choose? So there's a lot of moving parts. But if I had to just kind of like simplify all of this down based on what I presented, I would say it's safe to say that smite damage, it's safe to say, you know, it's just 20% better than skill damage, right? Because if you pick any of these like meta marches there, right, we take say like Luce and Alex, right, which is a very popular infantry pair. There's no skill damage mitigation in the infantry tree or the attack tree, right? But Luce himself has 20% skill damage taken reduction. So if you're hitting that march with a smite damage commander, naturally you're going to have a 20% advantage for the smite damage active skill as opposed to skill damage active skill, right? And if it's 20%, basically if you see a 2400 damage factor smite damage, you increase that by 20%, that's equivalent of a 2880 active skill. So William Wallace, his active skill was 2880 instead of a 2400 smite damage. Would the reaction to him be different? Probably, right? But people just kind of see the 2400 and they just think it's mid or whatever. But like it's almost like people fail to realize, where they don't fully grasp how much better smite damage is than skill damage, right? The other one is when you see a normal damage increase boost, how do you compare that, or how do you equate that to a skill damage increase? And I think it's equivalent to about 2.5 times compared to skill damage. So for example, if you have a 20% skill damage increase, I would actually equate that to about a 50% skill damage increase boost, right? I showed you the math earlier, just because if you want to launch an active skill, you got to actually do the white damage, right? And then when you add it up, 20% here was the equivalent of 46.67%, but I made it slightly higher just because when you have skill normal damage increase, right, you're always going to be able to benefit from that as soon as you make contact with the target. Whereas if you have a skill damage increase, you have to actually fire your active skill to enjoy that benefit. So it's probably more on the conservative side to say that it's 2.5 to 1. But if I see 20% normal damage increase, automatically I'm going to think it's equivalent of 50% skill damage increase, right? So now if you think back onto this march of Luce and William Wallace, right, they have 20% normal damage increase plus another 10% smite damage increase, right? So the smite damage increase is only going to increase the smite damage, not the white damage. This, if you use my formula, will come out to about a 60% skill damage increase equivalent, right? 20% normal damage plus 10% smite damage. If you saw that march with 60% skill damage increase, and then you saw William Wallace as a skill damage commander that's doing 22,880 single target active skill, will we actually think they're a lot better? Yes, we would, right? But because it's smite damage and a lot of these advantages are hidden or built into just the nature of smite damage, I think people are kind of underestimating how good William Wallace is and really like how good smite damage is. So I know I threw a lot of numbers in here, you know, it might have been a little bit confusing, but if you want the big takeaway, it's probably this right here. You know, it depends on the commander and the tree they're using, but I think smite damage is probably 20% or more better than skill damage. And then if you see a normal damage increase for a smite damage commander, I think multiply that by 2.5, and that's kind of the equivalent of what the normal damage increase is as far as the benefit of a skill damage increase. Okay, so hopefully I did a good enough job of convincing you why smite damage is good, and also kind of backed it up with some of the theory or math behind it. I know this could be a little bit confusing, so looking forward to the comments, and you know, any questions you guys have, I'll do my best to answer it. But again, thank you guys for watching to the end, and I'll talk to you guys next time.